War. War never changes. In the year 1945, my great-great-grandfather, serving in the army, wondered when he'd get to go home to his wife and the son he'd never seen. He got his wish when the U.S. ended World War II by dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world awaited Armageddon.
Cuba before 1959 was a mostly peaceful place. A lot of US businessmen did business in Cuba. It was flourishing with tourism. But in 1959, Fidel Castro came and won a revolution.
Bearing 26th of July banners, joyous followers of Fidel Castro sweep triumphantly through the Cuban capital hours after their rebellion had toppled the regime of Fulgencio Batista.
The US government supported the previous Cuban government and didn't support the revolutionary government. So Fidel Castro, after asking for help to the US, asked for help to the USSR, which kindly gave him help. But this help had some strings attached to it. These strings were that Cuba had to have USSR missiles. This was a problem because if we look at a map of Cuba, it's quite close to the US. The USSR only had accurate MRBMs, which were medium-range ballistic missiles. They couldn't throw them to the US from the USSR, so what they did was throw them from Cuba. That would be a better option. It is normal that the US was very scared. The US discovered these missiles when a U-2 spy plane was making a high-altitude pass over Cuba on the 14th of October 1962. It photographed the Soviet SS-4 MRBM being assembled for installation. President Kennedy was briefed about the situation on October 16th, and he immediately called together a group of advisors and officials known as the Executive Committee, or XCOM. If any of you have played the XCOM games, this is where it comes from. For nearly the next 2 weeks, the president and his team wrestled with a diplomatic crisis of epic proportions, as did their counterparts in the Soviet Union. This grew tensions, and when tensions grew between the US and the USSR, fear grew in the US. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had put the missiles in Cuba not only to increase the nation's nuclear strike capability, but also because the Soviets had long felt uneasy about the number of nuclear weapons that were targeted at them from sites in Western Europe and Turkey. And they saw the deployment of missiles in Cuba as a way to level the playing field. Another key factor in the Soviet missile scheme was the hostile relationship between the US and Cuba. The Kennedy administration had already launched one attack on the island, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, and Castro and Khrushchev saw the missiles as a means of deterring further US aggression, weighing the options. From the outset of the crisis, Kennedy and XCOM determined that the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba was unacceptable. The challenge facing them was to orchestrate their removal without initiating a wider conflict and possibly a nuclear war. In deliberations that stretched on for nearly a week, they came up with a variety of options, including a bombing attack on the missile sites and a full-scale invasion of Cuba. But Kennedy ultimately decided on a more measured approach. First, he would employ the US Navy to establish a blockade or quarantine of the island to prevent the Soviets from delivering additional missiles and military equipment. Second, he would deliver an ultimatum that the existing missiles would be removed. In a television broadcast on October 22, 1962, the president notified Americans about the presence of the missiles, explained his decisions to enact the blockade, and made it clear that the U.S. was prepared to use military force if necessary to neutralize this perceived threat to national security. Following this public declaration, people around the globe nervously waited for the Soviet response. Some Americans feared their country was on the brink of nuclear war, hoarded for food and gas. Showdown at sea. A crucial moment in the unfolding crisis arrived on October 24th, when Soviet ships bound for Cuba neared the line of U.S. vessels enforcing the blockade. An attempt by the Soviets to breach the blockade would likely have sparked a military confrontation that could have quickly escalated to a nuclear exchange. But the Soviet ships stopped short of the blockade. Although the events at sea offered a positive sign that the war could be averted, they did nothing to address the problem of the missiles already in Cuba. The tense standoff between the superpowers continued through the week, and on October 27th, an American reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba, and a U.S. invasion force was readied in Florida. The 35-year-old pilot of the downed plane, Major Rudolph Anderson, is considered the sole U.S. combat casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis. God bless him. The U.S. Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, said, "I thought it was the last Saturday I would ever see," as quoted by Martin Walker in The Cold War. A similar sense of doom was felt by other key players on both sides. A deal ends the standoff. Despite the enormous tension, Soviet and American leaders found a way out of the impasse. During the crisis, the Americans and Soviets had exchanged letters and other communications. And on October 26, Khrushchev sent a message to Kennedy in which he offered to remove the Cuban missiles in exchange for a promise by U.S. leaders not to invade Cuba. The Soviet leader sent a letter proposing that the USSR would dismantle its missiles in Cuba if the Americans removed their missiles installations in Turkey. It is also true that the US was playing quite unfairly at the time, and even though most sources put the US as the hero, it was actually the US who was the bully. If we look at it from another point of view, the US had put missiles on Turkey, so the USSR must have felt really threatened. So we can say that the US started the Cuban Missile Crisis because the US put missiles in Turkey. If the US could have missiles in Turkey, which has a land border with the USSR, why can't the USSR have missiles in Cuba? So after this deal, officially, the Kennedy administration decided to accept the terms of the first message and ignore the second Khrushchev letter entirely. Basically, they didn't remove their missiles from Turkey, and they just said they wouldn't invade Cuba. Privately, however, American officials also agreed to withdraw their nation's missiles from Turkey. You can see how the US just cares about their image. US Attorney General Robert Kennedy personally delivered the message to the Soviet ambassador in Washington, and on the 28th of October, the crisis drew to a close. Woo! Both the Americans and Soviets were sobered by the Cuban Missile Crisis. The following year, a direct hotline communication link was installed between Washington and Moscow to help defuse similar situations, and the superpowers signed 2 treaties related to nuclear weapons. The Cold War was far from over, though. In fact, another legacy of the crisis was that it convinced the Soviets to increase their investment in arsenal of ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles, capable of reaching the US from Soviet territory.